Good afternoon. I believe we are live and ready to go. Amir, still hearing me? We've got good sound?
Yes. Great sound.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone in the virtual space, whether you are here with us in this webinar call or if you are watching us on the Knox College YouTube station where we are streaming this Q&A live right now. Thank you so much for joining us for the second of our 7-part KeyNotes virtual jazz residency series made possible by the very generous support of the Jerome Mirza Foundation. We have many people to thank for making this fantastic series possible. Thank you to Knox College. I'm broadcasting live from there right now. Provost Mike Schneider, President Teresa Amat, the Knox College Communications Office. Very special thanks to Bria Cunningham and Lisa Van Riper, who've been instrumental in making all of the technology work. Thanks to iMagiqWorks for our stunning graphic design campaign, just beautiful. And all the thanks in the world to Andy Crawford, who is, as always, behind the scenes right this very moment, our managing director of the Knox Jazz Year. His tireless work behind the scenes makes every single thing that we do on stage and on screen look easy and seamless. My name is Nikki Malley. I'm the director of the Jazz Studies program here at Knox College, and it is a pleasure to have you here today. I am just seeing a message that the Knox YouTube is streaming between Amir and I instead of giving you gallery view. Let me see if I can fix that. We'll see. As I was just mentioning, Andy Crawford is always behind the scenes, so he's sending me secret messages, and just let me know about that. It's been an incredible feat of technological, learning curves for us to figure out how to do this. And we are extremely excited that it's worked so well, but every week I expect there'll be a little something we haven't seen before. So lastly, I would like to thank, and also by way of thanking, introduce tonight's keynote resident artist, Amir ElSaffar. Amir is considered one of the most creative and innovative performers, composers, band leaders working in jazz today. You've gotten a sense of that. You've just watched Amir's wonderful discussion on his own journey into the musical traditions of Iraq, and specifically maqam and microtonal practices, and how that journey has informed a transcultural approach to composition and performance in his own life and career. We are thrilled to have Amir here with us today, and I'm looking forward to a really great discussion. I can't wait to see what questions you have for him. And to that end, I will remind folks, we have some people here in the call with us. They're going to be submitting questions through the chat in this Zoom webinar. If you're watching us live on YouTube, you can also submit questions right to the comments on the YouTube live stream, and the magical Andy Crawford will be sending those to me over the airwaves, so those will get through to Amir as well. We will get through all the questions we can today in our 1 hour-ish session. So if we're inundated and we don't get to your question, I apologize, but we'll do our very best. If we were in a real room, we would be applauding as we welcome you, but you'll have to imagine it. So welcome, Amir. It's really a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for hosting me. Thanks to Andy once again, and to all of you who are attending today.
It's funny to know that there are people watching you all over the country and probably the world right now, and yet you're sitting in a room in silence. I suppose that's kind of our condition these days, huh?
Yeah, somehow getting used to it. But I don't know. Maybe we're still feeling the energy somehow of the connection through the moment, despite not being in the same space. But yeah, this is what we got for now. So
it's incredible, and actually, as strange as it is a little bit, it does offer us the opportunity to interact with so many people who we might not be able to have in person with us on campus. So it has afforded us some opportunities. And speaking of, I mentioned in our last session, the people who are here with us in the webinar call are Knox College students. So they will likely be submitting questions through the chat. I'm going to invite them now to go ahead and start submitting questions at any time. I warned Amir that I had a ton of questions for him and that I would only ask a few of them to not take up everybody's time, but it seems like it works well if I kind of get started with a couple questions and then we get some questions coming in the chat. So I wondered, I have so many questions, so they're not even in any order, but I loved that your discussion about your journey into learning about maqam really emphasize the fact that you spent a great deal of time doing this, that it wasn't kind of a 1 week foray into it or gathering a couple of albums and listening, that you worked to build relationships with mentors and teachers, and that this became even a longer project than you thought it might at the beginning. And I wondered, this is the ethnomusicologist in me maybe a little bit, but could you tell us a little bit maybe about how you established and built those relationships with your teachers? Because it sounds like you had some pretty significant relationships with teachers that you worked with for a long period of time. How did that kind of come about?
Yeah, indeed. I had in the beginning planned on spending 3 months actually, because I had a return trip. I booked my flight first to Morocco actually, because I started my journey in Morocco, then Tunisia, then I went to Baghdad and then Cairo, and I was supposed to come back from Cairo. I think I left in February and I was going to come back in May or something like that. But every step of that journey ended up wanting to extend more and more, because you just start to scratch the surface in a matter of a few days or a couple of weeks. In particular, when I got to Baghdad, which is where my father is from and where I still have relatives living to this day, and it took about 3 weeks before I had gotten through all of the relatives who wanted to have me over for lunch or have me for dinner, or have these azima, which is like a big, it means invitation or sort of gathering where they make every meal that you can imagine is in front of you and you have to eat, it. So, and it's probably some of the best tasting food I ever had in my life. Very, very nourishing, especially because I'd been away from Iraq for most of my life. But it was hard to show up and then just rush into, okay, where are the teachers? Where's the conservator? I'm here on a mission to take lessons. I mean, that we're human beings and we're interacting in a social way beyond our ambitions, musical and artistic ambitions. But it turned out that one of my cousins, this is how it works basically, is through word of mouth, someone who knows somebody, relatives. I mean, especially in these cities like Baghdad that are still, it was a city of 5 million at the time, but it still felt like a family. Like you mention anybody's name, oh, that's the family of so-and-so and the cousin of, people kind of orient themselves that way. So it happened that one of my cousin's wife's sister, had a print shop, and that was across the way in a little shopping mall from a music shop. So I took my first lessons with a guy named Abdurrazak Zawi, who was more specialized in classical music and actually marching band music. And so trumpet was nothing unfamiliar to him. But he was also the son-in-law of the great maqam master of the 20th century, who was a scholar and a santur player and a singer, who was kind of an idol and a mentor for me. I mean, so this was a familial connection that led me straight to the heart of the tradition. And, it's serendipitous, but it's also kind of how it works. It's not like a directory or like there are musicians unions, but that's not how you find the real connections and relationships. So through meeting him, within a month I was on stage performing trumpet, which is totally out of nowhere. I mean, this instrument doesn't fit in maqam at all, but I was invited by one of the singers to join him in a weekly concert series. So very quickly I was on the inside of this tradition and sitting with masters. Even though I barely spoke Arabic, I couldn't really understand what they were saying, but I had translators and I had cousins, and my cousins who drove me around and humored me in this odd, didn't seem to make any sense to them at the time, were incredibly patient and incredibly helpful. And then it was through another connection that I stayed in Iraq for most of 2002, and then when it became unsafe, because the invasion was just a few months away, the U.S. invasion, I left and went to England, and there was a great master, kind of of his generation. He's now 60 years old. He was in his 40s then, who everybody told me, you've got to go study with him. You've got to go. So his name is Hamd Saadi, and he was really the one who kind of took me under his wing and spent so much time teaching and going through every detail with me. So it's a combination of serendipity and familial connections and talking to people, sitting, being patient, not rushing into it. That was kind of how it worked for me.
And it's amazing how just one person can bridge that connection, and all of a sudden you've got the meaningful teacher mentor relationship that you might need. We've got a question in the chat from Sophia. She is a jazz piano student here at Knox, and also a vibraphone player, near and dear to my heart. And she asked a question that was in my list of questions too. She said, did you have to do something special to the vibraphone to make it fit into the microtonal music? And I had the same question as a vibes player myself. When you're doing these collaborative efforts, some of us have fixed pitched instruments. How does that work? Are there limitations? How do you work with those kind of the constraints there?
Yeah, the vibraphone is a very interesting case because we have retuned pianos, which seems like blasphemous to some people, but I actually learned, because to me it's like tuning the santur. I'm going to show you my santur in a little bit, but this piano is basically a very sophisticated santur, or at least I treated it that way when I tuned the strings. So we tuned the E's down a few cents, 40 cents to get that E half flat and then B half flat, and that actually opens up most of the modes. That's part of the trick, is you only need a couple notes outside of the Western scales to get a very, very close approximation to the maqam modes. Vibraphone is another case. So of course my initial thought is, anything you shorten, whether it's a tube on a trumpet or a string, shorten it, it becomes higher, elongate it, and it's lower. So I thought, of course, okay, let's take that E flat and shorten it, it'll become an E half flat. Well, in fact, that wasn't the case. What I learned, and as you probably know and vibraphonists know, most of the bars are manufactured at A444 or 446, even they're high, and then you have to take them to be tuned because everyone wants them tuned slightly differently, 440 or 442. Normally, when you do that, it's tuning the whole set of bars, all the octaves in that key. What we did, Jason Adashevitz, the vibraphonist who you saw in the video, we went to the factory where the vibraphone was invented in Chicago in 1908. Maybe you know better than I do. I think that's more or less when it was. This beautiful, huge building, 4 stories, used to be glockenspiels, marimbas, all the percussion instruments, and the vibes were invented there. Now, when we got there in 2008, it had gone from being this enormous factory to being one floor where there was an old man who was tuning the bars, and he was such an expert. He would literally, there's a grinder, he puts it on there for 0.3 of a second. He says, okay, that's going to lower it one cent. He hits it and it's exactly 1 cent. Lowers a little bit more, and then the bars get hot with the pressure from the grinder, so then he has to let them cool and then work. So there's a whole art to this that I became privy to just from this odd request. And he thought I was out of my mind asking for 36 cents on this note and 2 cents, and he's like, what do you until I could actually hear it, until he actually demonstrated it for me, because he doesn't just tune. So the inside of a vibraphone bar has an arch, and in the center is the fundamental, and then there's different points at the second partial, the third, and the fourth. I don't want to get too much into the acoustics and the harmonics of it, but it's quite a complicated operation. And tuning it down 40 cents was pretty crazy, but once we got there, it was such a beautiful and rich sound. It kind of reminded me of gamelan, which are these gongs from Indonesia and from Bali, where they're tuned in a non-Western way, and there's just a resonance that metal has in a way that like gut strings and nylon strings don't, because of the complex overtones. So I was just absolutely in heaven the first time I heard Jason playing. If you find that video on YouTube that I played, go to the very end, because there's a little vibraphone solo where all the instruments drop out, and he's playing 2 chords, and one is in equal temperament and the other is in microtones, and it makes your head swirl. It's a very interesting combination. So a long answer, but it shows you kind of what goes into, once you say let's retune the instruments. it's not just like, oh, okay, just lower that and horn players have to learn new fingerings, it's awkward that saxophones weren't meant to be played that way. But then, over time they become more and more familiar. So almost second nature. So, yeah.
That's fascinating. And so that vibraphone then is permanently now retuned, essentially, right? Because there's certain intonation retuning that you can't undo, just those particular pitches, those bars.
Just
right?
those bars. So whenever he comes to a gig, he takes out his bars and replaces them with the bars. And okay, I just have to. So he had made, this is the only set in the world that's tuned that way. We were on tour in Europe last 2018. I'm gonna keep this quick, but I was going between two projects. A group in Brussels that I was working with and Rivers of Sound was on tour simultaneously, and I was, fitting in a rehearsal in the middle of this crazy tour with 20 people on the road, and I had to take the bars, and the vibraphonist was like, okay, it's like he's giving me gold. And I was on the train, and so, if you can imagine, my mind was all over the place and lacking sleep. I left the bars on the train. And it was the day of the gig in this beautiful hall at Beaux-Arts, which is a wonderful stage in Brussels. And we didn't have the bars. And my vibraphonist got so upset, he almost left the tour because he was just so bummed out that he wouldn't be able to play. But by chance, one of the only factories in Europe, I think there's one in Berlin, and there's one at the border of the Netherlands and Belgium, about 1 hour from where we were in Brussels. And we were able to call them at 11 a.m. and have a rush job. They created the 8 microtonal bars for us in about 3 hours. And, this was such an insane proposition. Like, you've lost microtonal bars and you're in the middle of Europe. How's this? And because one person with the other ensemble I was working with was, I think there's a factory and what? Well, let's give them a call. No, we can't do it today. And I begged and pleaded with them on the phone. I kept making up stories about how all these famous people are coming to the concert tonight. And we sent a taxi from Brussels to the border and back. And by 6:30, an hour and a half before showtime, we had these microtonal bars in our possession, which is absolutely miraculous and insane. But
that really is. I can't even conceive of that being able to happen. But it's amazing when people are motivated. What it's gonna happen.
I thought I lost. The tour was over. I lost a friendship, and but it all worked out. So
wow. Well, he clearly knew how much it meant that by the end of it. Yeah. We've got more questions coming in. Sure. So one of these questions is from the YouTube stream. This is an alum of ours, Corey. He asked a completely unrelated question, as most of ours will be, which is awesome. He said, thanks for the presentation. Curious about the synth behind you and how you're using it in your practice. And that was in your video too. So it's been taunting us the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the elephant in the room. Like, what is? Yeah. So this is a COVID. A new hobby that I've developed since COVID, and I shouldn't call it a hobby because now it's becoming front and center in my musical research. And I never had much knowledge about electronic instruments prior to. I was actually a bit of a purist, only working with acoustic instruments, and there's something about the breath, the human breath, and the fingers, the way that they land on the string and the bow of a stringed instrument, and it's and the wood, it expands and contracts depending on humidity. There's something about all of that live element, and like the joza, for instance, the instrument that we use in Iraqi maqam is a coconut shell with the skin from a water buffalo, and it's very like if it's a little bit, if the temperature drops a few degrees, the sound changes. And there's something I love about that. And for a long time, I thought, well, electronic sounds, they're reproducible. You can, set the same settings, especially on a computer now. You can make that exact same sound repeat over and over. And I didn't like that. I like the malleability and changeability. I knew a little bit about modular synthesizers, but what I've discovered through this last almost year of research is that these instruments are also, in a way, replicable, in the sense that every time there's so many different parameters, and what I've really enjoyed is that I'm not going to give a full demo right now because I have other instruments I want to demo, but you start with a sine wave. A sine wave is the basic building block of all sound. Every sound that we hear is made out of a wave that's basically like a perfect, what do you call it? A sine. It's this shape, and the multiples of sine waves create different timbres. So the difference between a flute and a clarinet and a trumpet and a vibraphone and a piano is basically which overtones you're hearing, which sine waves are present and which ones are absent in the sound. And we kind of know this intuitively. You just immediately know what's a clarinet, what's a saxophone. But when you start to take it apart and do an analysis of the frequencies, it's, oh, well, there's very specific frequencies. The odd partials are being heard and the even ones are softer on that instrument. Okay, what gives? Well, it has to do with, it's a cylinder shape as opposed to a conical shape. So then you start getting into physics and you start getting into trigonometry and math, and it goes way beyond my expertise very quickly. But what's interesting with the electronic instruments is you can isolate these elements and take a waveform and then combine it with another waveform, and then boom, a new sound blossoms out of that. And so through the combination of very, very slow moving waves that are below our human hearing range, we hear between 20 and 20,000 cycles per second, meaning if there's a wave that's moving, faster than 20 cycles per second, we hear it as a pitch. If it's slower, we hear it as a rhythm. If it's much slower, we kind of perceive it subconsciously as, let's say, a form in a song. And then faster and faster and faster we hear pitches, and then it becomes the timbre, or the tone quality, up to 20,000 hertz, and then our hearing kind of levels off. So 20,000 cycles per second. So in synthesizer land, you can really be very precise about, a particular frequency and then multiplying it and multiplying it again, or dividing it, and then, oh, so that chord, that C major chord I've been referring to all my life, actually has a physical, a mathematical reality as well that exists in the waves. It's in the way that air particles move with pressure. So this gets very interesting to me, and I feel like it's kind of the culmination. I mean, I said it because of COVID. I got into it because I had time, but after spending years and years traveling around and discovering music from different parts of the world, suddenly like this electronic instrument, oh, that sounds like the gumbari I heard in Morocco, or this is a bit of a flamenco, it sounds like the dancer's feet. So I'm not interested in trying to reproduce the sounds that are already there in nature, but understanding them in a different way. Then it becomes less about, oh, this is the Iraqi tradition, or this is the gamelan that belongs to this society. Well, it's sound, and it's sound that's treated different ways, and you start to make a lot of connections also about how those sounds resonate with humans. And it's a very interesting and endless stage. I have one video on YouTube that I did with a modular synth. I'd only had it for about a month when I made the video, so it's very early in my process. It's Jazz Festival Sarajevo. You can hear some of what I was doing. That was back in October, but I've been developing it very quickly I shouldn't say quickly, but spending a lot of time these last few months. So thanks for asking, because I didn't get a chance to talk about it in the lecture. Yeah.
I love how that it dovetails so nicely with the explorations that you were talking about in your presentation, and how you're seeing all these different sound sources as potential resources in your music, and COVID hits, and now the synthesizer becomes another place to explore. I think it's an interesting extension kind of the story that you were just telling us. I have a comment, not a question, and I'm probably going to mispronounce the name. It's Ali or Aliyah. She's a Knox student who must be watching us on YouTube, because I don't think I know her. She's from Morocco and very fond of oud, maqam, tarab, etc. Transculturalism is central to my education and my passion for music. So I'd like to thank you for your amazing work. Not a question, but a great comment. That's awesome.
Thank you.
And then we have a question from Elias. How do you like to think about modes? Is it this scale but starting on this other note, or this scale but with these altered notes? Example, C Lydian is G major but starts on C, or a C major but with a raised 4. And people who don't know all that modal technical talk, I think that the foundational question is exactly how do you think about modes? Because I think in the West, we're often taught, well, even when we're taught modes, after we're taught major and minor scales, we're taught, well, it's a C major scale, it just starts on a different note. But I think that's not necessarily the way that other cultures and traditions conceive of those modes. How do you think about modes?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I would say there's at least three ways to address it, and I'm gonna try to be brief, and maybe when we have some lessons or group discussions down the line with the students, I can get more into detail, because it's some of it's a bit music theory based, but yes. So the way that I was taught the modes in school was like the Greek modes, which I refer to them as Babylonian modes because they have been discovered to have existed as far as 1750 BC in ancient Babylon. But you take the white keys of the piano, so C major scale basically, but that in the Greek is known as Ionian, so C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And then if you take the same notes, but you move up one step, you start on D instead of C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. Now you have Dorian. You move up another step. Now you have Phrygian. E, F, G, A, B, C, D. And each mode sounds very, very different on its own, but it's also this. It's the same pitches. It's just a question of what's your ending note or what's your starting note or what's your emphasis. And the character of, let's say, Locrian, which is the seventh mode, is very, very different from the character of Lydian, which is the fourth. Some of them sound very dark and kind of brooding because the intervals are very flat, and other ones the intervals tend to be higher. And that's one way to understand it. The Babylonian way of approaching it, and I'm going to just ask you to bear with me and try to conceive of this right now. So let's say we started with the Phrygian, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. So you have those 7 notes. Now we're not going to change the top and the bottom of that scale. What we're going to do is we're going to sharpen notes as we go. So now we're going to, and the whole idea in this was that the tritone was a problem. And the tritone is diablos in musica. It's the devil in music, because it's the interval that's not perfect. Everything is perfect. The fourths are very harmonious. The fifths are harmonious to our ears. The tritone is somewhere in between. So the Babylonian theory, as we understand it, was to fix the tritone, to get rid of it in the scale. So in this Phrygian mode, we have F and B is creating a tritone. So you raise the F to an F sharp, and now you've solved the problem, right? There's now F sharp and B have become a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth if you invert. Boom, everything's settled, right? Oh, but no. Now F sharp is in a tritone relationship with C. So we fixed one problem, but we created another problem. Well, let's do the same thing. We raise the C to C sharp, and you fix that tritone, but you create another one. So basically, in the Babylonian system, you don't change your tonic. You keep it in the same space, but you're sharpening notes. So as you make F, that becomes Aeolian. As you make C, C sharp, it becomes Dorian, etc. So musicians who are familiar with the modes might be able to follow so far. But suffice it to say that if you continue in this, you actually get all 7 modes in all 12 keys, because eventually you get to the end of the cycle and then the whole thing goes up a whole half step. So this was discovered on a tablet from Babylon from 1750 BC. They only found it in the 1950s, and after about a decade of trying to decipher what it was, they thought it was a written language, but it didn't make sense. Then they discovered that it was a musical, how to tune the harp. Then there's the maqam approach, which has a similar thing. So now this is a good segue to start showing you how the santur works. And I can also kind of demonstrate how this works. So here, I'm going to just change my camera angle. I'm actually going to change cameras. Let's see if this gives a better view of the santur. Okay, you can kind of see it. It's a little too close up, but at least you can see the strings, right? So that's a C or a do, and it's basically tuned like the Western system, except you're going to hear some quarter tones. I think you'll recognize them, but I'll also point them out. I'm going to lower the mic so you hear the instrument better. So just now I was demonstrating a maqam called rast. It's very difficult for me to just show it as a scale. To demonstrate it, I need to play phrases. So, in that sense, to impart the mode, it's really in the phrasing that the mode comes to life. If I just play the notes, they don't really mean anything, just up and down. And I embellished and elaborated on. I could be much more concise and just, you know. And any musician familiar with this musical language would know what I'm referring to, but it's the phrases that make the mode, and that's really the case in all music. Like we learn in jazz theory that, you know, there's Dorian, like a 2-5-1, Dorian, Mixolydian, Ionian, these notes, these modes, and then of course there's the altered versions of those. But it's the phases that make it what it is. Like, so playing bebop, the language of bebop isn't just the names of those modes. It's the phrases that we hear Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, Sonny Stitt, all these musicians. It's what some refer to as phraseology. And it's when you learn those phrases that you become, you kind of master those modes. So Dorian, I'm sure the way the Greeks played it in ancient Greece, and of course the way they play it today is quite different. And just another part of it is that there are the stylistic differences, the regional differences from one place to another, but in fact the modes kind of want to be played a certain way. Like there's certain tendencies, there's certain pitches that are emphasized, and other ones that are not as important, or not, you don't emphasize them, or certain notes that are malleable, that can be you can sort of play with the intention, other are more fixed. And those are, again, you know, it's kind of in the math or the physics of the sound that it becomes apparent why that's the case. But they also manifest themselves as stylistic particularities or idiosyncrasies of a particular language or musical place. So it's a long answer because it's a very, very deep and detailed subject, but I hope that satisfies the question, and that we can dig into it some more when we all get together.
Well, and if
virtually.
it doesn't satisfy the question, then that's all the more reason for students to go out and learn more, right? Some of these
Oh
things, I
yeah,
mean, that's
yeah.
why it took you years and years, and anybody who delves into a musical tradition, years or a whole life, right? So it's these things
It's
are
endless.
complicated for reasons. Got lots of questions coming in. Our Moroccan student, Alia, again, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. She wrote back to say, I also love Southern Spanish music and flamenco and keep hearing both worlds in my head with their differences and similarities. So my question is, how does your creative process start, or has it started, working with all the repertoires, instruments, and cultures, as I'm sure it must have opened so many possibilities. And I don't want to read too much into the question because I only have that there, but I wonder if she's asking about like the more musical traditions you have familiarized yourself with, started to work with, do those start to kind of move back and forth in your own mind, the way she was talking about hearing all these things kind of layering, speaking to each other across cultures, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And the flamenco, which I showed a little bit in my lecture, and also the project, which I didn't have a chance to show video of, but that was a project where I went to Tunisia and Morocco and to Mali and found musicians that were working with a it's a trance music that's exists throughout North and Sub-Saharan Africa as well. It's kind of one musical language that has different manifestations. But really the flamenco was the first project or first musical form that I dealt with where I really didn't. I mean, again, it's a lifetime to learn all the palos, all the phrases, all the modes. It's a very very deep and detailed tradition, and I didn't set out. So prior to that, I always worked within the musical languages that I felt at home with. So maqam, jazz, classical, whether you know, I understand the nuances of those languages, and to the point that this is always the trick when you're combining different musical languages or approaches, is that what sounds to one perspective, a phrase might sound melancholy and dark, but to another it might sound upbeat or uplifting, or might have another context, and usually sad and happy, kind of those basic emotions translate pretty well, but sometimes there's a lot of nuances and you have to be very careful how you say something so that it's not offensive or out of place in one context as opposed to another. So I was very sensitive to that for the 10 or 12 years that I was really working only with the musical styles that I was deeply connected with. And then when I was asked to do the flamenco, I kind of decided to take a different approach, which was to surround myself with that music, to listen to it, nonstop, but learn some of it, learn the basic theory, but I didn't try to become a flamenco singer or guitarist or dancer or something. It's too much. But instead, what I did was to try to relate to it in an emotional way and find that the ones that really grabbed me in a spirit sense, in a more less than the technical way, and maybe intuitively connect it with a maqam where the feeling was the same. So for me, going to Spain and sitting in tavernas or sitting in concerts and watching the way the audience reacted to certain phrases, and okay, that's and I'd feel it too. There's something in that phrase that and it's a feeling that I've had in a blues bar in Chicago. It's a feeling that I've had in a maqam coffee house. So it's resonating in that same way, but with totally different means. The musical language is different, but the intention, what it's reaching on that nonverbal emotional state is clear. So that was my starting point. And then the other thing is, when I to get all the musicians, I could have been the director, the composer who writes out everything, and okay, the singer's going to sing this, but why she's not going to sound any she's going to sound her best singing what she knows the best, and I'm going to sound my best playing what I know the best. So then it really became more about having a conversation where she would sing something in a flamenco mode and I would answer in a maqam mode, and kind of finding a common ground. But it took a long time. It's not easy. I had a very difficult first couple, weeks of rehearsals, and then it started to take shape over time. I mean, the other part about transcultural music is just the time that it takes for personalities and for the workflow and how we organizing our, ourselves. It's a lot of levels to it, but I hope that's an answer to the question.
Yeah, another question you could probably talk about for we could talk about for hours. Here's a really easy question because it's a one sentence answer. Well, it might not be that easy. Elias wrote back and asked, since you referenced being so influenced by the Beatles early on, what's your favorite Beatles album?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there were two that I used to listen to all of their albums, but I think I really liked Rubber Soul. That was like sort of the end of I feel like there's two eras. There's like the 62 to 66 era, and then there was the 67 to 70 when they weren't touring anymore. But I really loved that album. And then the White Album, I think when I was a 9-year-old, I would really trip out on that one. And I thought it was so cool. And so I used to listen to Revolution 9 backwards because you could hear hidden messages in there. I thought I was like, there's some really profound, then it spooked a bit. But those albums, I felt like they were in the height of their creativity and openness, in the sense that if I could look back on why was I moved, like the early stuff is sweet, the Hard Day's Night, Please Please Me, these songs but they're kind of these very packaged, perfect songs. And then Sgt. Pepper, which is an incredible revolutionary album. Well, I don't know. No, they're all great. But there was something about the explorative nature of like the White Album, some of the songs in Rubber Soul, Revolver even more so, but where they just kind of hit a sweet spot of I don't know, but they were kind of a miraculous musical phenomenon. So yeah.
They sure were. Yeah, and it's almost impossible to ever, if you really love a band or an artist, to single out one album. So I'm impressed that you were able to hone in on a few. We had a question, kind of a general question, but about maybe seeing a little bit more demonstration of some of the ideas that you talked about in your lecture. And I am injecting myself a little bit here. I'm interested in, because for some of us, hearing microtones is so hard, or something that we're not used to doing. And I'm curious, so I'm adding my own little question into this question. On the trumpet, how you navigated that. Were microtones something that you were working with before you took this deep dive into maqam? And then, so you're saying no. So how does that inform your trumpet practice? How do you do that? I mean, we don't have to, turn it into a trumpet masterclass necessarily, but I think people are really interested in seeing how you take an instrument that is traditionally not played with these microtones in mind, and how those appear, how those sound, and how you think about them as you're playing them, maybe on one or both of the instruments.
Yeah, and that's getting back to the challenge of playing, certain instruments like the oud, which was mentioned earlier, or the santur, are really designed to be played microtonally. I mean, the santur, any pitch you want, you can move the pegs to exactly that microtone, or you can retune the strings quite easily. But trumpet, as we all know, it's got 3 valves, a traditional trumpet anyway, and each of these valves is, by the way, they're up until the middle of the 19th century, trumpets didn't have valves. They were all played with just like a bugle, basically. But there were these natural trumpets that were very long, so they could find ways of playing in the high register that sounded more like more melodic. But that's why not until the Romantic era do you really hear very advanced trumpet parts. But like each of these valves, like this one lowers a half tone, this one lowers two semitones or a whole step, this is 3, and then the combination. So, but they're all roughly equal tempered notes. Every instrument has its own sort of imperfections because of the way that acoustics work, but there's not really a place for quarter tones on the trumpet. So the first thing I did when I wanted to learn Arabic music when I was around 22, 23 years old, I found an instrument that had an extra slide that you could operate, sort of like a trombone slide. It would lengthen the instrument. So that was a way of getting it, but it wasn't really the ideal for a number of reasons. I won't go into details now, but I eventually discovered that, every trumpet, what maybe non-trumpet players don't know is that there's also these slides, and these are meant to correct the intonation on the notes that are slightly out of tune. So, for instance, I'll give an example of a note that's naturally out of tune on the trumpet, and just give me a signal if it's too loud or too soft, because I'm, doing this by ear here. But so here's an example of an out of tune note on the trumpet. That last note is a little bit too high, too sharp, and so we actually use the slide to bring it down. So we just, we learn that in school, and then we kind of do it automatically as trumpet players. But I started to ask myself at one point, well, what if I start using this slide, which goes a lot further than is necessary to fix that one note, as a means of reaching quarter tones? So I started to then, so that second is not or it's and sometimes people don't really notice that there's these microtones happening because there's something kind of natural. They're not meant to be dissonant. It's not like trying in these very slight gradations of pitch that are they're actually meant to be kind of somewhat consonant. And even the santur I was playing earlier, I was doing a very high microtone, but that's not exactly a half flat. It's probably, if I pulled out a tuner, I could tell you, but it's more like a third, or a little less than a third. This. So that's technically how I was able to do it on the trumpet, but in order for me to really get these microtones right, because you can learn a fingering, but if you're not hearing it, it's not likely to sound in tune. Like I thought, there are saxophone fingerings, and you put this finger and this finger, and there's an E half flat. But if the person's not hearing it, and it's a strange thing, how do you quantify that? Well, he's playing, it's the right frequency, it's the right tuning, but it's really when they are embodying that sound. So for me, having grown up playing Western music, I actually did, part of my deep dive into maqam was to learn how to sing. And by singing, you don't have there's nothing mitigating the sound. It's you and it's your voice, and you have to be able to fully embody the sound. And I thought I was just going to sing for a few weeks or a few months, and eventually I ended up taking it very seriously and becoming a performer, a vocalist. So I would advise anyone who really wants to learn to sing to play microtones, learn how to sing it, because it's really, I think in music in general we should all learn how to sing, but especially for the microtonal stuff, and then it'll become more natural on your instrument.
I wonder, as I'm hearing you play that, the more you hear and can manipulate the instrument to make microtones on the trumpet in particular, has that had positive or negative effects on your classical and more kind of Western equal temperament tuning performance? Are there times where you hear a microtone that you want to play, but it's not appropriate for the context you're in? Or does it make your ear for intonation sharper now? Not sharper as in a high note, but more kind of, I don't know, you're honing in on all the gradations. I don't know. Has that informed your playing, or has it caused any problems?
I would say it's informed my playing in a positive sense. In terms of playing classical, I would have to really spend a good 6 months in the woodshed just practicing my double tonguing and all, because what did happen, I kind of had to unlearn the way that I play trumpet and my classical way of playing and relearn in the maqam sense. And it was a question of the microtones, but also sonically. I mean, you probably notice I'm playing with a more soft, I don't know how much is coming through here, but a breathier sound. And also, in classical music, you really want every note to be crystal clear. You want and in maqam, you kind of learning how to play in between and massage that space in between the notes. So like, it's hard to go right back to playing classical, and it changed even the way I play jazz. It did heighten my sensitivity to pitch in other contexts as well, in terms of hearing jazz or Western harmonies and stuff like that. And fortunately, in terms of improvisation, I've always been in circles where it's cool to, come out with sounds that other people aren't playing. So, like, I really enjoy working with like a jazz, quintet or whatever that's playing in equal tempered and throwing in microtones, because it does something in that context. When everything is microtonal, it starts to sound like normal and undetectable, that there's for an untrained ear. And even like my first album, Two Rivers, every piece was based on microtones. The last track, I called it The Blues in E-half flat. And when the reviewers wrote about the album, they said, oh, and the last track includes microtones. Because I put it in the title, they could understand that it was there. But because, like I said, it often just goes right by. People don't necessarily hear it when the whole context is microtonal.
As you were talking about this, getting some comments from Jill, who is our clarinet instructor. She's a great jazz clarinet and sax player as well, and just a great music educator altogether. She said she sees some similarities between microtones and bent notes in jazz or blue notes, slurs, lip slurs, etc. And she's wondering if you could play us a jazz line with microtones, because it's something. I'm reading into her question now, but how a melody works for you, incorporating microtones into it, something that you might play in one of your compositions or an improvisation.
Okay, like not coming from the tradition, but coming from like my own approach.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm reading into her question, but I think so, yeah.
So the blue note is actually a good point of departure. So, and actually there's a lot of similarity with maqam. So, for instance, the blue note is this kind of sound that's between major and minor. That's the way it's usually talked about. Like, you hear clarinet. If you listen to any blues, that's the other thing. When I go back and listen to the blues, like what I used to think was minor, I mean, Muddy Waters doesn't sing a minor third, he sings that in between third, and that's really the hallmark. And that's actually the same tuning as a maqam tuning as well. So there's a historical connection. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it's so. So that neutral third, now in a more of a bluesy jazz. So if I make up something else. piece called the Blues in E half flat. Here's the melody. So that's based on and then if I want to go even further into sort of like almost free microtonality, and more you can get into kind of almost 24 tone music. I was really exploring that for a while. An album called Radif Suite that I did with Hafez Modirzadeh. We were kind of making new harmonies, new chords based on this, and new modes that weren't maqam, they weren't jazz, but they kind of had the DNA of like blues and jazz tuning combining with maqam. So I think that's available online somewhere. Radif, Radif Suite, Suite, and the second half of that is my composition, so you can kind of hear. But I have to really like spend time. Like I'm not practicing that every day right now. I'm doing other things on the trumpet, but actually playing the Bach cello suites. I got a nice flugelhorn, so I can play the low notes. I'm doing my best. It's hard to do it on any other instrument than the cello, but so I'm going deep into equal temperament now. But what there's a certain vocabulary that I was really working on, but it's very crunchy. I mean, I get fingers deep into these using the slides all the time and the fingerings. But yeah, it's a fun area to explore, and I wish there was more of it in jazz. So, yeah.
Right at the end of your answer, you may have actually answered the question that came in while you were answering the last question with that discussion of Radif. I forgot the name of the album. It was the Radif project that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
Radif Suite.
Yeah.
From our YouTube channel, Jim asked, do you feel like there's an area of unexplored mixing of Western modes and these tunings that could produce new discoveries stylistically? It sounds like maybe that project may have been an example of exactly that. You were prescient in answering a question before you even heard it, possibly.
Yeah. Well, it's a natural segue. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's ultimately the goal in a way. I mean, it's nice to join cultures and to join, kind of known spheres of, musical languages and bring them to, and I really enjoy doing that, and it's really, sometimes it's very clear where the origins are, but there's really, when you get into this uncharted territories where you don't know exactly what you're referencing. Is it a maqam melody? Is it jazz? Is it this? Or it just is what it, but I mean, I there's something about the training and the integrity is through having earned a discipline, and then you can create. I mean, it would be I think it's possible, and I would love to see it happen where someone just dives right into microtones. I really hope one day to have a student, beginner, and get them playing microtones, in their first year of, instead of doing all the exercises just with equal tempered, because it would be so second nature to that person that they could maybe make some very, very unique and new sounds. Maybe some people listening right now. But yeah, there's a couple of other projects I've done. One is called Interstice or Interstices. That I did with a group, and the one in Belgium that I famously lost, or the one I was referencing earlier, where I lost the microtonal bars, where I was really trying to find like new chords and new. They kind of sound like, you know, early 20th century Bartok kind of harmony, but it's a minor six, but the sixth is a half flat, and this third degree is a three. You kind of end up with these new resonances that are remind you of something, you know, but it's nice because they're ambiguous, because you can kind of hear it as it's in between these two sounds. So depending on how you're attuned, you might hear it as more major or more minor or more bright or dark, or, you know. So there's a lot of gradations and nuances, and that's what's really fun about microtonal music. And I'm kind of surprised sometimes that, like, I know there's systems out there, like there's spectral music, which has got a whole thing about the overtone series and the undertone series, and there's lots of different divisions of the octave, different practices where they divide the octave into 17, into 24, 31, 106. But there's very little of just, let's find the sound, what sounds good, and I don't know what it's called right now. It's just this note and this note, and we have a beautiful dyad, and then from there we can make a triad, and then, well, it doesn't have to be in a system, and maybe the system emerges from those discoveries, or from that exploration. So I really encourage people, you know, I think that's the frontier that we haven't really, I mean, yes, there's a lot of stuff out there, but it's so isolated, and it's not commonplace to really get out of this rigidness of the equal tempered system. I mean, I love equal tempered music, but there's so much else possible. Yeah, different ways of tuning and stuff.
I think that's a beautiful question. And actually, I'm all caught up on questions, which is perfect because we've organically gotten to that 1 hour period, except the one question that either Andy or I always ask guest artists is what you're listening to right now. We always are fascinated to know what people working at your level of creativity, what you're inspired by. I mean, you mentioned you're working on the Bachcello suites right now, so I suspect you're listening to those as well. But who or what are you listening to right now?
Well, so much really, but I've been kind of re-exploring some of the late romantic era in classical music for the last couple of, well, right now in particular, because I'm working on an opera. It's going to be a few years down the road, so but I am watching and learning about operas from different periods, but in particular, I think the late 19th, early 20th century. So I'm kind of revisiting that music that I was very far from for a long time. And then also in my electronics exploration, there's a few composers that I've been checking out. It's hard to find their work, but like Eliane Redig, who was one of the early, worked with tape, with tape, but also modular synthesizers from the 60s and 70s. And then, and I'm studying with a guy named Todd Barton, who is one of the pioneers of synthesized, experimental synthesizer music. And I've been listening to him and some of the people from his cohort as well. So, I think those have been my two main areas. I'm not in the phase anymore of like, there was a period where I was trying to find every music from every part of the world, and I'll be there again at some point. But there's so much, especially if you look for LPs, you can find. Oh, I guess on YouTube it's all available. But it's endless, and it's constantly evolving, and you never arrive. That's the beautiful part about the journey.
Well, and I think that your story and your music makes such a good case for that. And I love that we end with that question, especially with you, because it inspires us to go listen, but you've also given us so much inspiration about how you can take these different kinds of streams of music that you're influenced by and create something new with them as well. I think that's a really powerful message. And I love that we're ending with that message. I feel like we could talk for hours. I can't believe that we've already gone an hour. Wonderful questions. I'm sure that our students are going to have more questions for you as you work one-on-one with some of our students.
Certainly.
But I guess I get the pleasure of doing the wrap up, and of course I start the wrap up by thanking you so much, Amir ElSaffar, for joining us, for creating this fantastic video lecture for us, for joining us this afternoon, for working with our students. Amir, as all of our residency artists are as part of this residency, the thing you don't see off screen, they're working one-on-one with students in the Knox Jazz program, following their work here in the virtual realm. We're extremely lucky to be sending our students off into the virtual world with you over the next couple of weeks. It's been such a pleasure to have you here. I just thank you from me, thank you from all of us at the Knox Jazz Year. Thank you from Andy, who is of course behind the scenes. And then I turn my MC hat on for a second to thank all of you who have joined us here in the webinar and who've joined us on YouTube. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you again to the Jerome Mirza Foundation for making all of this possible, and for Knox College for their support of this ambitious project. A couple quick notes. Amir's presentation and the Q&A that we just finished or are finishing will both be available on the Knox College YouTube channel. You can share those if you're an educator, share those with your students, sit back and watch them learn. Again, there's a lot to digest. Please feel free to share those and help us spread the word. We have 5 more keynote presentations and discussions coming up over the next 4 months. Our next keynote, we had 2 back-to-back. We have a couple of weeks off before our next, which is Allison Miller, drummer, band leader, composer, all around powerhouse of a spirit and person. She's going to join us on Sunday, February 21st for, again, a 3 p.m. presentation and a Q&A to follow. Her presentation is called Creative Making Right Now, and it focuses on all creative makers. So while she will be certainly talking about music, it really will be applicable to people in all the creative fields: vocalists, instrumentalists, visual artists, dancers, choreographers, poets, writers, actors, more. She's going to tackle questions like, how do we make art during these troubling times? And how do we make a difference while we're stuck at home? Just a few small questions to consider. And as a reminder, you can always follow us on Facebook at Knox Jazz Year. You'll get updates about the upcoming presentations. You can scroll back to find links to Amir's presentation and all the presentations as we get through each one. You can learn more about our upcoming artists. And you can also learn more on the Knox website. Just type in Mirza and you'll get right to our page. Thank you, Amir, so much. Thank you, all of us, to everyone who joined. And I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. It was really a pleasure. And I sign off and wish everyone a fantastic evening, I guess, or wherever you are, evening, morning, afternoon. Thank you so much, Amir. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
And good night from the Knox Jazz Year. And Amir,